welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name is Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Welcome back, everybody, to another great week, another installment of something new we're talking about. We are going to talk about one of the most common explanations people give when a relationship starts to struggle. And that's because somebody inside of it has changed. Now, maybe one person became less patient, or somebody started setting boundaries, right? Whatever the change happens to be, people often point to that moment and say, that's where the problem started. And I think that's an understandable explanation. It's not often incomplete, because over the years, I've noticed that some relationships appear remarkably stable for a very long time, 5, 10, 20 years. They've survived conflict and disappointment, massive or enormous strains that, other couples would just normally buckle under. And from the outside, these couples tend to look really solid, even healthy, right? Now, before I get into all of that today, I want to say thank you for all of you who continue to listen, share the show, reach out. For those of you coming in from all over the world that send me your emails, your comments, all of it. Whether you've been here or you're just finding the show now, I appreciate you being here. I do read all of your messages. That's why some weeks, I'm always calling out some of the cities from Belize to Lisbon, Canary Islands recently. Thank you. I do see you. Love to know what it's like down in the Canary Islands as far as the scene goes. And a few other places in between, right? If you are listening, you're following me on Spotify, do me a favor. You're on the app, go over, click the 3 dots, rate the show 5 stars. That allows the show keep growing, reaching people who need to hear it, right? If you value and found these conversations of use, consider, clicking and subscribing. You can find me on YouTube as well. That way you'll know when each new show drops. There is a support link in the show's description if you want to donate anything. Keeps these conversations going. All right, let's get back to it here. Now, I think there's something interesting that sits underneath a lot of these relationships. Sometimes the stability isn't coming from the relationship itself. It's coming from one person constantly managing the tension. They fix the problems, they make the accommodations just to keep everything moving forward. Now, over time, that effort becomes so normal that nobody really notices it anymore, right? It simply becomes the way the relationship operates. The person doing it often stops seeing it as work at all, and the other person adapts because it's just been there. So the system settles into a balance that appears stable on the surface, but that's because somebody is carrying the entire cost underneath it. And that's brings us to the question I want to explore today. What happens when the person carrying the relationship decides they can't do it anymore? Right? So this first part, we're going to talk about the job nobody realizes they're doing. When people hear me talk about somebody carrying a relationship, they often imagine something obvious, right? They imagine somebody doing all the work while the other person does nothing. And sometimes, that does happen, but that usually is not what I'm talking about. Most of the time, the person carrying the relationship isn't carrying everything. They're carrying the things that no one can actually see, the emotional weight, right? They pay attention to the tension before the conflict. They make the adjustments. They just, get done what needs to be done to keep everything moving forward, right? And they remain quiet, especially when things start going sideways. And what makes this interesting is that these roles rarely start intentionally. Nobody sits down at the beginning of a relationship and says, hey, I think I'm going to be the emotional manager here. And nobody volunteers to become the fixer or the caretaker, right? These roles usually develop because somebody is better at it, or more comfortable with it, or more willing to do it. And then a disagreement happens, and one person takes responsibility for smoothing it over, right? The problem shows up. They take responsibility for solving it. somebody gets upset, somebody adjusts behavior, and the cycle starts. Each individual decision here makes sense. The problem is that over time, those decisions start accumulating. What began as helping becomes responsibility, and what began as responsibility becomes expectation. And eventually, what became expectation simply became normal. And I see this all the time in relationships and dynamics inside of the lifestyle and even marriages, right? One person becomes responsible for maintaining the emotional health of the entire relationship, right? They start the difficult conversations, they check in after maybe a argument. They make sure that the problems do not go ignored. Because if they stop doing it, all that communication starts breaking down almost immediately. And you see similar patterns in dating relationships, right? You get one person who plans or initiates or repairs just to maintain the connection itself. So the relationship moves forward because somebody is constantly providing the momentum. Family systems work the same way. Every family has people who absorb tension for the group. And they're the ones who keep the peace, and they manage the personalities and even try to contain conflict from spreading. And most families don't notice how much work that person is doing until they stop doing it. And then our DS side. A lot of people assume that a dominant is carrying responsibility because they hold authority. And sometimes that is true. Other times, submissives become responsible for managing the emotional climate of the relationship, right? They monitor moods, anticipate needs, right? They do a lot of very hard work just to maintain stability. So the labels here don't mean, themselves don't really determine who carries the weight. The pattern does. And what all of these examples have in common is that the role becomes invisible. The person doing it stops recognizing it because they've been doing it for so long, it's just normal. And the people around, they stop recognizing the work because they've become accustomed to receiving the benefit of it. So what was once effort simply becomes part of the relationship. And that's where people often make a mistake. They look at the relationship and assume the stability they're seeing is coming from the relationship itself. But sometimes that stability isn't coming from the relationship at all. It's coming from the one person continually investing effort to prevent the instability from becoming visible. So, Chris, why does the system work for so long? Well, it's a great question. I'm phrasing it like this because I want you all to understand here's the pivot, right? This is why we do it. So, one of the reasons these types of arrangements last for so long is because, frankly, somebody adapts to them. And human beings are remarkably good at adapting to whatever becomes normal. So if something happens once, we notice it. If it happens over and over, we begin to expect it. And if it happens for years, we don't even see it anymore. And that's often what happens inside of these relationships. The person carrying all the weight adapts to carrying it. And the person who benefits, well, they just adapt to receiving it. So the entire relationship organizes itself around the structure that nobody consciously designed, but everybody has learned to live within. So what makes this particularly difficult here is to recognize that the arrangement, while it often works, it only works for a little while. Because if you only have one person constantly solving the tension and the problems and repairing the conflict, right? If they're absorbing all the emotional pressure, the relationship may appear to feel calmer than it normally would because you just have one person consistently submitting and just bowing out. Now, from the outside, again, this looks like it's functional. But what people often miss is that the system is functioning because somebody is preventing the consequences from reaching the system altogether. So think about it this way. If you have one person who avoids difficult conversations, but the other partner always initiates them, communication appears to be working, right? We can agree on that. If one person is irresponsible, say with money or finances, and the other person constantly compensates for it, the bills get paid, right? The consequence never fully arrives where it was created. Instead, somebody intercepts it, they absorb it, and then they manage it. And because of that, the relationship never receives accurate feedback about how well it's actually functioning. And this is where the psychology becomes interesting. Accommodation is simply the process of adjusting ourselves to maintain instability or the appearance of stability. And we all do it. Even healthy relationships require some sort of accommodation. We compromise, we adapt, we make room for each other's strengths and weaknesses. The problem appears when the accommodation only moves in one person's direction. When one person is consistently adjusting and the other person is constantly, being adjusted for. And the relationship can start operating like borrowed stability. That's why these arrangements can actually last for years, not because they're healthy, but they're effective. And those two things are not the same thing. The person carrying the weight usually doesn't wake up every morning feeling resentful. Most of the time, they just simply believe they're doing what needs to be done. They tell themselves they're being supportive and responsible, even committed. And the other person, on the other hand, is, they don't have any reason to believe anything is seriously wrong. So from their perspective, the relationship appears to be functioning. There are problems, of course, and every relationship has them, but somehow things just keep working out. And when they do keep working out, right, what ends up happening is we adapt. But that's because somebody is making sure they do. They're making sure, that one person is making sure that the problems really never see the light of day. But here's the thing. Both people can honestly believe at the same time the relationship is healthy, even when one person is quietly becoming exhausted, right? One of the mistakes people make is assuming that because something has been stable for so long, it must be healthy. Those aren't the same thing. Stability simply means that the system has continued functioning. Healthy means that the system can continue functioning without one person paying an unsustainable cost to keep it that way. And you know what? Sometimes it takes years before anybody can realize the difference. And guess what? The moment someone stops carrying it, this is the big part. And this is the part I want you all to listen to. This is the difficult part, especially when it comes to the person carrying the relationship reaches a point where they can't do it anymore. So people often assume this happens because somebody suddenly stops caring. Now, in my experience, that's not usually what happens. More often, the shift comes after years of carrying the responsibilities that were never fully acknowledged. They're tired, they get burned out, their work or their professional life and health starts suffering, right? And even resentment starts to build, right? What's important to understand is that the decision is often less about what they want and more about what they can sustain. They can no longer keep absorbing every conflict or fix every problem, right? The level of effort that once felt manageable no longer is because they just don't have the energy anymore. And that's when something interesting starts happening. The relationship often appears to get worse. The arguments increase, tension, right? Conversations start to become more difficult. And now the relationship begins feeling unstable in a way it, may have never felt before. And after all of this, especially after all these years where things just seem to be working before. So the problem is what appeared to be working may have heavily been supported by one person's effort. Imagine a relationship where one partner constantly smooths over every disagreement or takes care of every time there's a conflict and just absorbs, right? All of a sudden, they're adjusting all of their needs in order to keep the peace. And the day they stop making those adjustments, the tension starts to increase. Now, it's easy to look at those moments and just conclude that a boundary created the problem. What often goes unnoticed is that the boundary may simply be exposing a problem was already there. And this is one of those reasons that boundaries frequently create more conflict initially rather than less. What a boundary does is it removes the layer of support that had been holding the system together. The instability was already present. The difference is that somebody no longer wants to absorb it before, it reaches the relationship. And the other partner frequently experienced the shift as rejection or abandonment or even unfairness. And from their perspective, the relationship was functioning yesterday and today it isn't. So they might feel confused why, things seem more difficult or even angry or hurt. What they're experiencing, however, may not be the relationship getting worse. They're experiencing the loss of a support system they never fully realized was there. More so, they even took advantage of. Somebody else was managing all of that tension before it became visible and was actually brought to the relationship. That person was quietly doing the work that allowed the system to appear more stable than it actually was. Now that the work is no longer happening, and that is the point, the hidden parts of the relationship begin coming into view. All of this unresolved problems become visible. So the imbalance starts to become visible. So the tension is there, right? All of these things that were once managed privately begin appear, to show up in public. The relationship may look more unstable now than it ever did prior. So the question is whether it actually became more unstable, right? Or whether everyone is finally seeing what it was all along, especially once somebody stops carrying all the weight. Now, before I get back into this show is supported by Enhanced Mind Counseling. A lot of the work I do with people involves understanding roles they've taken in and on for their relationships: the fixer, the caretaker, the person who keeps carrying everything, right? What we've been talking about today is often the point where people start realizing just how much they've been carrying and how much of their life has been organized around managing other people's problems that were never theirs to solve alone. That's the kind of work I help people sort through. If that's something you're trying to understand in your own life, you can reach out through my website. There's a link in the show's description. All right, let's get back to it. So, when the real problem finally appears. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about the person carrying the relationship and their role. We've talked about how these arrangements developed, how they can last for years, right? Hide in the background. And when the person carrying the weight finally hits their limit. Now, what often happens next is that the instability starts spreading, right? So, for a long time, the cost was being paid privately. One person was absorbing the stress, managing all the tension, right? Keeping everything from getting to the surface. But once that stops, the pressure has to go somewhere. So it shows up physically, right? People get tired, they don't sleep well, maybe they're not eating all the time, right? They're just overwhelmed. Or it shows up emotionally: anxiety, resentment, depression. The things that once felt manageable become or begin to feel impossible. So, what makes this particularly difficult is that many people don't immediately recognize what's happening. They continue to approach the situation as a relationship problem that needs to be solved. They look for better communication and boundaries, or some sort of conflict resolution, or some strategy that might finally make things work again. And to be clear, sometimes those things do help. But the problem is that many people eventually realize they are no longer trying to fix the relationship. They're just trying to survive it. And that's a very different realization. When somebody spends years carrying responsibilities that should have been shared, the question slowly changes, right? At first, they're asking, how do I make this work? Later, they're starting to ask a whole different question: how do I keep this going? And eventually, they start asking a question they've often avoided for a really long time. As a matter of fact, I discussed that with somebody today. What is this costing me? And that usually is the moment everything begins to look different, because the cost is rarely limited to the relationship itself. Children adapt to tension family members, right? Entire households begin organizing themselves around problems that were never properly addressed. Everybody learns how to function around the instability rather than dealing with it directly. That's why these situations can continue for so long. People become remarkably good at adapting to unhealthy systems. But adaptation and health are not the same thing. And that brings us back to the central idea behind this entire episode today. The relationship did not become unstable when one person stopped carrying it. The instability was already there. The difference here is that for years, somebody was managing and absorbing and keeping all of it out of sight. When they finally stepped back, everyone assumed the relationship changed. In many cases, what actually changed was visibility. So for the first time, people were seeing the relationship as it truly was rather than it had appeared when someone was working tirelessly to hold it all together. Now, as I wrap this up today, I know this is not a long one and I'm not doing a lot of justice to this today, but I don't want to get too into depth because I'm going to lean too much into therapy territory. But I think it's important to come back to the distinction that a lot of people never really talk about. There is a difference between participating in a relationship and being responsible for it. Now, participation means contributing, showing up, communicating, supporting each other, right? All sharing the responsibility for whatever the two of you are building together. That's a healthy relationship. Being responsible for the relationship is something entirely different. That's the belief that the relationship only works because you make it work, that it's your job to absorb the tension or solve the problems or manage somebody's emotions just to keep everything from falling apart. The healthiest relationships I've ever seen over the years are not the ones with the fewest problems. They're the ones where responsibility is distributed. Both people contribute to the stability of the relationship. They adapt. They take ownership of their part of the system. When all of that responsibility becomes concentrated in one person, yeah, the relationship may survive for a very long time, but survival and health are not the same thing. And carrying everything is not the same thing as loving someone. In fact, I think a lot of people confuse the two. They convince themselves that the more they sacrifice or accommodate, even endure, right, that they're somehow more committed to the relationship. Sometimes what they're actually doing is protecting the relationship from problems it needs to confront. Love requires a lot of effort. Relationships, DS, requires effort, but healthy effort should move in both directions because a relationship is a two-way street. It's not a bike path. So I'm going to leave you with my question today that I want you all to think about because we've all been in relationships. Not all of us have experienced this type of relationship, but I'm going to bet many of you have. So here's my question I want you to sit with this week. If you stopped managing everything tomorrow, what would happen to the relationship? All right. That's the one I want you to think about today. I'll catch you up all on a few things. It's been a busy couple of weeks for me, so I'm a little behind on some of my emails. I'm trying to get back up to speed on it. Yes, I'm managing I got an email about my comment section. Yeah, I'm kind of a little bit more proactive in it. If the comments are getting to the point that they're being um, disrespectful, I guess is the best word. I'm no longer engaging. I don't have the time for it. And I'm not going to put in the mental capacity for it. And I'm not here to educate people. If they want to listen, great. If they don't, they want to have their own theory, perfect. The research is there. I back up with what I know and 10 years of, experience plus, right? Anyway, um, no, I've stopped working on my book right now because I'm tired. Let me just answer that question. I've got a lot going on, trying to get it all done. Do I have a new worksheet coming out? Probably not for another few months. I probably won't put out one until, I don't know, October, maybe November, right? I think I have 8 up on my website. You can go and get them. So that should cover all of that. The reason, why am I doing this today? Or this wasn't a question, but I figured somebody's going to end up asking me, because I always get asked, why do you do the shows you do? Because there's been a lot of people lately that I've been working with that are experiencing this in their relationship or their marriages or their dynamics. And their dynamics or marriages or their relationships in general are crumbling, and they don't know how to maintain it anymore. And they're even at a point that they have to now just consider the transition part where they move on, right? And so I thought this was really relevant to talk about, because I think, I'm seeing a lot of people carrying it. So I figured it was a good discussion. I want to hear your thoughts on it. I want to talk about this. I want you all to expand on it, share, because when you all share, you're not just sharing with me, right? You're sharing with each other to give each other support in a way so others know they're not alone. I do want to address one other thing. And I don't know if this person's going to listen or not. I got a comment last week that when I do interviews, I only pick, maybe I misread it. I'll paraphrase. The way I assumed it was phrased was that I only pick attractive people to talk to on my show. If you want to come on my show and talk to me about something, send me an email. We'll coordinate a time and we'll go from there. I talk to anybody who wants to talk to me. I have reached out to this point after 5 years, probably a couple, I don't know, not probably 2,000, but well over 1,000 people. Now, I haven't done that many interviews in my time on the show because I prefer this. I prefer talking to you all, right? Interviews are a little bit different. They're also a little bit trickier. But with that said, I don't talk to somebody because of their aesthetic. And it has nothing to do with clicks. If you know what I've been doing for this show and doing for this community for the last, well, this is year 5. So I'm we're 4.5 years in for me doing this show. You don't know me because I don't get paid to do this. I support my practice pays for me to do this show, right? That's why the show is free. It's not behind Patreon. I'm not asking you all to buy me coffee, or I don't have Throne, right? I'm not asking you to buy me a microphone or a chair like I see other podcasters do that are in the community that are taking advantage, right? And I believe that wholeheartedly. I believe that, right? But if you benefit from what I'm telling you, do me a favor. If you don't like what I'm saying, don't follow. But if you're going to criticize how I do it or the people I interview, but then don't want to be interviewed, just hold your breath. I'm really not interested. I'm not saying that because I know that's going to come across as you're being an ass. I'm not being an ass. I'm being real. I will literally have a conversation with anybody if the topic I think is, it's also going to be a topic that's going to be relevant to the community. But please don't think that I do this for some sort of weird social media thing, because quite honestly, that means none of you or the people who are making these comments don't know me. I don't share my private life. How much of my private life do you all know? You don't know a lot about me. You know I'm a vet. You know I worked in law enforcement. You know I'm a therapist and that I help the kink community and I've been around. Great. I don't share my private life, and I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. And the only reason I'm kind of harping on this today, because this comment stuck with me. I will keep this about the work for as long as I can keep this about the work. There are psychologists I respect that have 30, 40, 50 years of clinical experience. Now they're in a different phase of their life, and they've transitioned their professionalism to more about them. And that's fine. I think they've earned it. But it's not about the work anymore. It's about what they can do for themselves. And that's fine. I'm, again, not against it. I'm trying to keep this about the work, right? That's why you all don't know a whole lot about me. And that's the way I prefer to keep it, right? And I'm not asking you to all come and start asking me questions either, because most time I'm not going to answer them anyway. There's a lot of reasons behind that. If you followed me on social media, you probably know why. Anyway, that's enough of all that. Said my piece of let that out, get off my soapbox here. Let me get back to the question. Today's show. I ask you all one more time, and I want you to sit and think about it. It's going to be up on the socials. So talk about it. Comment section, YouTube, Substack, Fetlife, Instagram, X, wherever. Talk about this. This is not just a cathartic process for me. It doesn't do anything for me. It's for you all. And it helps others. You all will realize once you start talking, you're not alone. Right? So here it is. If you stop managing everything tomorrow, what would happen to your relationship? Just think about it. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.